My name is Raymond Geuss, and I've been asked to talk to you about Montaigne. I ask you to read, as a preparation for this, two essays by Montaigne, two short essays, a very short essay called Of Idleness. It's only a page and a half, and a slightly longer, but still relatively short essay called Of Cannibals. So I hope you will have read both of those two essays, and I will focus my remarks on those two essays. Second, I believe that Dr. Finlayson has passed out to you a handout, which is an outline of the sorts of things I will talk about today, so that you can follow basically you can follow the lecture by looking at the outline and seeing where I am there. So that's the way I'm going to proceed. Now, Montaigne was a very wealthy noble who lived in the 16th century in southwest France near Bordeaux. And the two important features of his social context are, one, that he lived in a feudal society. That is, 16th century France was still a society that was basically organized around feudal structures. Now, by feudalism, one generally means a very decentralized form of political and economic organization. So a feudal society is organized around individual manors that are more or less self-contained, autarkic. And what it means is that there are individual centers of power that are not completely subordinated to the central power. It's only a century later that the French kings begin to get absolutistic and begin to be able to organize France as a single, completely unified space under their control. They had the idea that they would love to do that, but they weren't able to do that, certainly until a century after Montaigne. So Montaigne is living in a world in which, as a political participant, an aristocrat in Bordeaux, although he's in some sense officially part of the Kingdom of France, there's an enormous amount of local autonomy. So it's a very decentralized society and a very decentralized set of political institutions. Second, feudalism is characterized by the fact that a feudal society is divided into different classes. They're formally different classes. Generally, they divide feudal societies into three classes, but I think it actually makes more sense to divide it into four classes. The three officially recognized classes are the clergy, that is, priests and nuns and people in religious vocations, aristocrats, members of the nobility, and the bourgeoisie, who's in principle everyone else. But the bourgeoisie, although the bourgeoisie is officially everybody else, the bourgeoisie actually refers to the urban craftsmen and the urban owners of various kinds of trading establishments, etc. So there's the clergy, there's the aristocrats, there's the bourgeoisie, and below the bourgeoisie, as it were not part of the political system at all, are serfs and servants and hangers-on of various kinds. And when I say these are formal distinctions, that means, in fact, that in law, if you are a member of one, there's no universal law that's good for everyone. If you're a member of the clergy, you have your own laws. If you're a member of the aristocracy, you have your own laws. If you're a member of the bourgeoisie, you have your own laws. And of course, there's a certain amount of overlap between them, but basically it's a society that's divided in this way, in a very formal way. And as I've said, Montaigne belongs to one of these groups. He's an aristocrat. He's a member of what's called the noblesse de robe, which is the administrative and political elite. He was very active in the civic life of Bordeaux. He was a counselor. He was involved in legislation. He was mayor of Bordeaux for a while. He's a very active aristocrat with a local power base. That's the first thing to know about him. The second thing to know about him is the 16th century is a time of religious civil war in France. As you know, the Reformation begins at the very beginning of the 16th century. Luther in Germany, Zwingli in Switzerland, and Calvin in Geneva. And in France, too, there's a very, very large Calvinist, that is Protestant Calvinist minority. They're called Huguenots. The Huguenots are French Calvinists who reject the domination of the Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, of course, there was a kind of religious conformity under the Catholic Church. In the 16th century, however, the uniformity doesn't exist anymore because the majority is Catholic, the institutions are Catholic, but there's this very, very important Reformed movement of Calvinists who in fact are engaged in an uprising, a series of uprisings against the Central Powers. They're being repressed and they engage in military action. So the 16th century in France is a period of civil war between the Catholics and the Calvinists. And it's not the kind of civil war you might think. That is, it's not a civil war with clear boundaries. There are Catholics here, there are Protestants there. It's rather like feudalism itself, very decentralized. There are little groups of Calvinists here, there are little groups of hyper-Catholics there. They're all engaged in warfare against one another. There are bands of robbers that are traveling around the country. Montaigne at one time says, well, I remember when I was outside my chateau, it was during the second of the religious wars, or maybe it was the third, I don't remember. And so this is a feudal society where there's a lot of local confusion, and it's highly militarized and highly dangerous. And it's one where religious beliefs are considered to be highly dangerous. Now, Montaigne, at the age of 38, makes a decision. He decides he's going to abandon public civic life in Bordeaux. He's going to give up his posts and he's going to retire. And he retires to his chateau, his estate in the countryside. So he withdraws from the city altogether. And in his chateau, he even has a tower built, a tower which, of course, it's a way of protecting yourself to be in a tower. So he isn't just in the chateau, he's in the chateau and he has his own tower. And in the top room of the tower, he makes the top room of the tower into a library, and he withdraws from public life there, and he spends his time up in the top room of this tower. Actually, the tower still exists. You can go and see it near Bordeaux. He withdraws from public life. He gives up his position as judge and counselor. He withdraws to the country. He goes into his room with his books, and he decides to engage in reflection, idle reflection. He decides to spend his life thinking, reading, reflecting, and writing. And what he begins to write are forms of prose, which he calls essays. Now, Montaigne is the first person to use the term essay to refer to a piece of prose writing. The word essay itself is not an invention of Montaigne. Essay is just the normal, everyday, bog standard French word for trying something out, a trial, an attempt, an experiment. Je vais essayer de commencer. I'll try to begin. It's just a completely everyday word. So Montaigne takes this everyday word and he gives it a special meaning. He says, the essay is a term I'm going to use to describe this kind of writing that I'm doing. It's a particular kind of writing, and it's different from any other kind of writing. And really, if you look at it historically, it is very different from previous forms of writing. He did really invent something there. Now, what sort of thing is it that he invented? And for that, I suggest that you look at this first essay that I suggested that you look at, namely of idleness, where he tries to talk about what the essay is and what he's trying to do with it. Now, the word idleness is the French word oisiveté. And that word comes from the Latin word otium. So, and Montaigne actually was a native speaker of Latin. He was not a native speaker of French. His father was an educational reformer and had him brought up as a native speaker of Latin. Montaigne couldn't speak French when he was a child. He had German tutors who spoke to him only in Latin, and he had special servants who spoke to him only in Latin. So he grew up as a native speaker of Latin, and then he learned French. So he would have known that oisiveté comes from otium, this Latin word otium. So the first essay is the essay on otium. Now, otium is a loaded term for the Romans. That is, idleness is not just a common word. That's a philosophically loaded word. It comes from Cicero and Seneca, various Roman philosophers who made a study of the spheres of activity and the kinds of life that a Roman aristocrat could engage in. And they said, look, there are really two spheres of life. There's the sphere of otium, idleness, leisure, and there's the sphere of negotium, that which is not idleness or leisure. That is the active life of military activity, political activity, of being busy. Negotium is the life of being busy, being active, being engaged, the public life. Otium is the private life, the life of idleness, the life without any responsibilities. And Cicero and Seneca have various complicated discussions of the relations between these two spheres of human life. And you can see that Montaigne is appealing to this distinction. He led the life of negotium. He was involved in politics and public administration, etc. And now he leaves the sphere of negotium and goes into the sphere of otium. He withdraws to his castle, to his tower, and he engages in reflection and reading. He withdraws from public life. And now Montaigne gives a double comparison, which is intended to illustrate something about this distinction between the sphere of otium and negotium. He says, think of this distinction between negotium, public activity, and retirement. Think of it as like the distinction between a cultivated field or a cultivated garden and a fallow field or a fallow garden. That is, the life of public activity is a life like the life of cultivating a vineyard. You try to grow grapes, you plant things in rows, you cultivate it, you weed it, you water it, you do various sorts of things with it. If it's a garden, you give it a shape, perhaps it's topiary. That's the life of negotium. It's like agriculture. It's like the cultivation of a field. And in contrast to that, the life of otium, of leisure or of idleness, is a life in which you let the field grow fallow. You leave it uncultivated. You leave the garden untended. So that's one comparison he makes between these two spheres of life, two kinds of life, and a cultivated and an uncultivated garden. But there's a second comparison that he makes too, which is between a cultivated field, an uncultivated field, and two different states of mind, not two different spheres of activity, but two states of the human mind or the human soul. So he says, we've got on the one hand the public life, that's like the cultivated garden, and that's like the mind when the mind is engaged in an activity that's teleologically directed to producing something. And then we've got the life of otium, which is the life withdrawn, the life of reflection. And in that life, I'm left to my own devices. It's like leaving the garden untended, or leaving the field untilled or fallow. And there's also a state of mind, which is the state of mind in which I'm not pursuing definite goals in the external world. I'm not subject to the teleological and instrumental imperatives which require me to do certain things. I'm out of that sphere altogether. And so now he's going to connect the writing of essays with the cultivation, with otium. So the essay is the appropriate form, the appropriate literary form for the retired life, and the appropriate literary form for the state of the mind when the state of the mind is not subject to cultivation or discipline. So if you look at the handout, you'll see I've made this little list of comparative things about negotium on the left and otium on the right. So as Montaigne says, negotium is the life, the active life in the public sphere is like a cultivated garden which has a clear form. A garden has a form, it has a shape, especially a French formal garden. The paths are tended, there are geometric structures, and it's maintained in that shape by constant vigilance and constant effort. The garden doesn't become like that by itself. The topiary has that form because I send the gardener out there every year, and the gardener slaves in the middle of the day to give it that form. And the gardener weeds, and someone else waters the field. So it's only by virtue of clear, persistent, constant effort and intervention that this shape is maintained. Furthermore, in the sphere of negotium, the cultivated field that's maintained in shape is maintained in shape in order to be useful. I don't cultivate a field for nothing. I cultivate the grapes in order to make wine. It's useful for something. I cultivate the wheat in order to make bread. I cultivate the garden so that I can go there and display my wealth, or I will have various sorts of reasons to cultivate the garden too. So it's useful, and then he says, and so you can see that a literary form that's appropriate for this kind of human activity, the literary form that's appropriate for engaging in public life or cultivating gardens, the literary form of that would be the tractatus or the treatise or the handbook. If I want to cultivate grapes, I want them to be useful, and I can have a handbook. And there were plenty of handbooks around since the ancient world, a handbook which will tell me in an organized, orderly, clear way what I need to do to make the yield good. And similarly, if I'm a military commander, I'm leading the life of negotium in the military sphere, I will have a book on strategy, which will tell me if you're besieging a city, you put your troops around it, and then you dig a trench, and then you make siege engines, and then you try to breach the wall. There'll be a sequence of things. And a handbook or a treatise or a tractatus or a manual will be a book which has the right literary form to engage, to give you guidance in the world of negotium. And of course, since the ancient world, there are handbooks on this sort of thing. The Greeks had handbooks on agriculture, they had handbooks on medicine, they had handbooks on statecraft. We might not think they're very good, but they had them. And they were all structured, they were clear, they were consistent, and they gave you direction. They told you, in May, you do this, in June, you do that, in July, you do that. They were reasoned, they were organized, they were rational, they were consistent, and they had a direction. And the direction was the direction of producing something useful. Now, that's the world of negotium and the world of the tractatus, or the treatise, or the handbook. Montaigne then says, but look, that model is inappropriate for the world of otium, the world of leisure, or indolence, or inactivity, or idleness. It's completely inappropriate. Think of the world of living retired from public life. I'm sitting up here in my library. I have slaves serfs who are taking care of various things for me. I'm not engaged in public affairs. I'm not engaged in military activity, except if I'm forced. I'm sitting here, and what am I going to do? I'm like a land that's been left fallow. I don't have any shape. My life doesn't have any shape because I've withdrawn from all the activities that would have given my life shape. What gave my life shape was being a military commander. Since I was a military commander, I had to besiege this city. Since I was the mayor, I had to deal with an outbreak of some disease. Now I'm sitting here in my library by myself. The land, I'm like fallow land. There's nothing that's happening here. And so I will see what happens if I simply sit here by myself and I don't impose a shape or a form on my thoughts. In particular, I do not impose a shape or form on my thoughts, which is a shape or form which I impose on them in order for them to be useful for some particular purpose. So the land is left fallow. I'm retired. I'm leading this life of indolence and inactivity. My mind is simply spinning my wheels. I'm not intervening in my mental activity. I'm just sitting here and reflecting. And now he says, and you might say what will happen will be my thoughts will be useless and wild and uncultivated. And that's right. And they'll be potentially contradictory, and they'll be unstable, and they'll be shifting. And that's right. And the appropriate literary form for that is the essay. So the essay is not like a handbook. It's the literary expression of a mind that's allowed to go fallow, that's uncultivated, not subject to discipline. And the essay tracks what a mind will go through in that way if it's not constantly subject to instrumental intervention from the outside. Now, you will say, quite rightly, if otium and the essay is useless, if it really is useless, it's useless. Why do it? Why do it? Why write essays then? If they really are disconnected from any kind of useful purpose, they're not structured, they're contradictory. As he says, they're like weeds that grow up in this garden. I stop cultivating the garden and suddenly it's full of weeds and it's overgrown. Why do it? And the answer to that is that the world of negotium is a world in which we're oriented toward dealing with the world in ways that are actionable. If I'm a military commander, I want to know how to besiege this city. The world of the essays, the world of otium, is a world in which I come to know myself. So the reason I might write essays is not to find out about how to conquer a city or how to rule a city or how to do anything in particular. It's that I come to become acquainted with myself. And the idea is that I will become better acquainted with myself if I look at my mind when it's in a state of otium. I will become better acquainted with who I really am if I think about myself, if I don't structure my thoughts in a way that conforms with any kind of instrumental necessity. I simply allow my thoughts to emerge as they wish to emerge, like all these weeds that come out. Because, and think of it, because to the extent to which I'm a military commander and I'm trying to besiege a city, and my thoughts are thoughts that are structured by that goal, to the extent to which I'm doing it well, I'm doing exactly the same thing that any other military commander would do. Every military commander in the 16th century knows you put your troops around the city, then you dig a trench, then you make siege engines. So in acting in that way, in acting in the sphere of negotium, I'm not actually expressing my individuality, and I'm not actually finding out anything about myself. I'm finding out about how to besiege a city when I see how my mind works when I'm besieging a city. I don't find out about my mind in itself. I find out about my mind in itself when I take away all of the utilitarian considerations and I just let it go by itself. And then it will put all these things up. So now notice, first thing, that this conception of the essay is very, very different from later conceptions of the essay, because it's completely focused on self-knowledge. The point of the essay for Montaigne is that Montaigne comes to know himself, and you come to know yourself in some way by following this. That's very different. For example, one of later philosopher Nietzsche also thought of himself as an essayist. He wrote essays. But for him, the essay was partly, of course, an attempt to come to self-knowledge, but partly it was an attempt to illuminate the variety of different perspectives from which you could see objects in the world. So as I think you've heard already, so the idea that in a university exam you're going to be asked to write an essay makes no sense, would make no sense really for Montaigne, because the essay is supposed to be self-knowledge. And if you take a physics exam, if you're being a doctor and I'm going to examine you in the medical exam and you write an essay, I don't want a doctor who knows himself or herself. I want a doctor who can actually set a broken leg. So in a way, so the essay is about self-knowledge. Traditionally, of course, there's a long tradition of this. This means that the essay has tremendous importance, although it does not have instrumental importance, because traditionally people have thought that self-knowledge, which is what the essay is supposed to be about, is an absolutely ineluctable, unavoidable part of ethical thought and the ethical life. And now, why would you think that self-knowledge was part of the ethical life? Part of being a good person? I think it's fair to say that in traditional ethics, there are two foci. There's a focus on my relation to other people. So to be a good person, to be an ethical person, is to behave toward other people in a certain way. That's one focus. Another focus is there's an emphasis on knowing how to be happy. So the goal of ethics is partly to treat other people in the right way, but the goal of ethics is also to help the individual become happy. And now in the ancient world, people tended to subsume the first of those under the second. That is, they tended to think if you actually showed people how to be happy, part of what it was to be happy would be to treat other people in the right way. Now, I think that's pretty ridiculous. But anyway, they get 1,000 years in ethics, people tried to do this. But let's put that aside then. But even if we put aside the ethical component, which is dealing with other people, the traditional idea is ethics means has something to do with helping you to be a good person. That means being happy. And to be happy is to get what you want. That seems perfectly natural. But to get what you want, you have to know what you want. I might get what I want without knowing what it was that I want, because it might just happen to me. But in general, if I want to be happy, I want to get what I want. Well, I have to begin. It seems reasonable to begin by trying to figure out what it is that I want. But the question of what I want is not a trivial question. That's the central insight in traditional ethics. And one of the reasons why traditional ethics is completely incompatible with the standard liberal stuff you hear from John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill and these liberals all say, okay, a person is the final judge of what he or she wants. Nobody can tell me what I really want. I'm the only one who knows what I really want. The traditional view is, well, knowing what you want is not a trivial undertaking. You can't just list what you want, because many of the things you think you want, you don't really want. So traditional ethics is dependent on this distinction between superficial things, which I may think I want them because people have told me they're good, and things I really want, some kind of essential desires that I have, really authentic desires. And I might not know what they are simply by listing the things that I think I want. So there's an important step from just looking at what sorts of things I want to finding out what I really want. So self-knowledge is finding out what I really want rather than what I may think I want, because advertising has convinced me that maybe advertising has convinced me that I want a car some kind. Well, I don't really want a car. Okay. So the essay contributes to self-knowledge, and self-knowledge contributes to letting me know what I really want, and letting me know what I really want allows me to have a better shot at being happy. Knowing what I really want won't in itself make me happy, perhaps, but it will be it'll be better to know what I want than not to know what I want if I'm trying to be happy. Now, at this point comes a crucial shift. The traditional view is ethically, at base, we're all the same. All humans are the same. There's a basic human nature. Really, what we finally want, all of us, is something fixed. It's difficult to find out what it is, but it's fixed. We all want the same thing, really, down deep. And that thing that we want is a bedrock we can use. So I, as a philosopher, can analyze human life, and I can come down to this fundamentum inconcussum, uncontrovertible foundation, which is some basic desire that all people have. And it's there, and it's fixed, and it's rock bottom. And that means that I, as a philosopher, can tell you in some cases better than you can know yourself what you really want, therefore how to be happy. And that means that in principle, it would be possible for me to impose on you a regime. So I as a philosopher can tell what you really want by finding out what all of you really want. By finding that out, I can see what will be conducive to allowing you to get what you want. And I can therefore make out a series of disciplines and ordinances and regimes which will allow that to happen. That's the traditional view. Now, Montaigne rejects that view completely. That is, he accepts the view that self-knowledge is an important part of the ethical life. He accepts that, but he denies that there is some basic human nature that expresses itself in fundamental human desires, which are unchangeable and form the bedrock of any such thing. He rather thinks that if you look at what people want, if you look in the state of otium, if you look at the state of idleness at what people really want, and you observe what they want in real life, you see it's constantly shifting and it's constantly different. Maybe there are some similarities, but nobody can figure out any kind of fundamental human want and desire that's characteristic of all human beings and that could serve as a basis for a philosopher telling us how we ought to live our lives. Rather, there's no regularity, there's no law. There are accidental things that look like regularities. And of course, there are regularities in the sense that they're things that recur, but they're all accidental. They can change at any minute. So what people want is constantly changing. And that means that no one else can give you a prescription for your own good. No one else can prescribe a regime for you that will satisfy your wants. Now, this is the basis of Montaigne's absolute opposition to the sort of Kantian way of thinking about the world, to what he calls ordonnance and discipline. This essay, Idleness, is one of the first ones he wrote. One of the last ones he wrote, which I didn't ask you to read, but if you ever have a chance, you might read, is called De l'expérience, On Experience. It's the last essay in the last volume. And in the last essay in the last volume, he says, this is the sort of culmination of his view. He says, there's no way of conducting a life that's so stupid as leading your life according to ordinances and discipline. N'est train de vie si sot et si débile que celui qui se conduit par ordonnance et discipline. So now that doesn't mean that there is no place for laws or regularity or ordinance or discipline in life. It doesn't mean that at all. It's not an anarchist view in that sense. What he says is, there might be place for laws. Of course, there are places for laws in the world of otium and in civic life. We can have ordinances, we can have disciplines, all of that's important. But you don't lead your life exclusively by law. So this is an absolute rejection of the Kantian. Kant thought that human beings were constantly self-regulating beings, basically, that I always led my life according to principles. As you know, Kant regulated his whole life according to principles. He took his walk every day the same way. He had a principle that said that he was only allowed to have one pipe a day, because otherwise, if he didn't have a rule that said he could only have one pipe of tobacco a day, he could have any number of pipes of tobacco a day. And how could you possibly tolerate the strain of not knowing how many pipes of tobacco you were going to lead in a day? So you had to have a rule, and it had to be one. Your whole life was a series of formulating rules and living according to rules. His students, of course, got around this by giving him the largest pipe they could possibly find so that he could light it in the morning and it would last the whole day. So you can see the typical sort of sophistry of a person who's desperate to have rules, but desperate also to find loopholes in the rules. So what Montaigne says is, yes, we have to have laws, etc., etc., but that's a contextual, specific sort of thing we need for regulating the traffic. Don't think don't think that a good way of leading your life is by internalizing rules or making up your own rules. It's really stupid. Débile. That's, of course, what traditional philosophers tried to do. So, okay. Now, so I don't subject my thoughts to discipline when I'm sitting in my tower. I don't subject them to discipline. I don't subject them to ordonnances, to injunctions. I just let them emerge unsupervised. And now, what does Montaigne think is going to happen? He says, he says in this early essay, well, all sorts of noxious and silly sorts of things will emerge. But I think that by allowing them to emerge, allowing them to become clear, I will deal with them because I will be ashamed of myself. So essays in which I allow the shifting, different thoughts I have, changing desires, constantly changing desires, I allow them to emerge in the hopes that there'll be a kind of catharsis. But the catharsis will operate not by imaginatively realizing these desires, as you might think for Aristotle, not imaginatively realizing these desires, but by virtue of the fact that these desires become ashamed of each other. I become ashamed of myself, and that will somehow deal with them. Now, I simply point out that later in his life, I think he came to a slightly different attitude toward this. I think he did think originally that, as I said, this is an early essay. He did think that if I allow these thoughts just to emerge, I'll be ashamed of them and I will be able to overcome them. Later, his model of a lot of ethics is a relation of friendship or understanding or acceptance. And so he's very keen on the fact that he wants to become a friend to himself. He wants to treat himself with the same kind of understanding, tact, and acceptance that he uses for dealing with his friends. And later, I think it's more likely to think that he doesn't think that by allowing these thoughts to emerge, they will become ashamed of each other and ashamed of themselves. Rather, I think that he thinks that if I allow them to emerge, I'll come to know who I am, and I will gradually become able to accept them in the way I accept the foibles of various of my friends. And therefore, I'll know myself and I'll become a friend to myself. And that's a good ethical state to be in, to accept yourself and to be friendly toward yourself. Now, having said that, there is a problem, of course. Montaigne suggests in this essay that if I have a garden or a cultivated field, which is maintained by constant effort, and I take the effort away and I allow it simply to grow wild, the result will be that it goes back to nature. And in some sense, that looks right. When I have the garden cultivated, I have roses. I have the roses in geometric beds, perhaps. I have paths. I have everything nicely structured. And gradually, if I don't have it tended, creepers will come in and animals will come in and the paths will be overgrown and etc., etc. It'll look wild. It'll become savage. But remember that if I have a garden in which I've cultivated roses for 20 years and I let it grow wild, in one sense it gets back to nature, but in another sense, of course, it doesn't get back to nature at all. Because if I've got roses in there for 20 years, even if I don't tend it, even if I don't tend the garden, there'll be weeds there, but there'll be many, many more roses than there would be if I hadn't planted roses there. So once you've cultivated the field or the garden, just stopping the cultivation isn't going to get you back to zero. You'll still have an overgrown garden of roses. You won't have pure nature. And that is and similarly, if I spend my whole life, or if I spend 30 years of my life as a lawyer, and I subject my mind to discipline, and I use legal concepts, and I use legal terms, and I use legal theories all the time. And now, at the age of 50, I give up my legal career and I go back home and I sit in my tower. Is it plausible that legal forms of thinking will then suddenly play no role in my life at all, and that my mind will go back to being natural or uncultivated? No. So this, I think, is a sign which, I think Montaigne later, and this is what happens in the essay, I think, on cannibals, which is the second essay, attempts to show that the whole idea of going back to nature, simpliciter, makes no sense. Just as you can't find what is the basic rock bottom set of human desires, which everyone shares, so similarly, you can't, once you have, all societies are forms of cultivation. In every society, the world is cultivated in a particular way. Therefore, abstracting from that particular form of cultivation and letting it all grow wild is not going to get you back to the state of nature. So the whole idea of getting, just as the whole idea of getting down to the desires that we all share, which are essential, makes no sense, the idea of getting back to pure nature makes no sense, doesn't make any sense at all. And I think that's a really important thing for Montaigne. And that's where, as it were, cannibals begins, namely with this notion of self-knowledge, and the notion of self-knowledge in the context of an attempt to get back to nature. Because the other thing that Montaigne thinks is, he thinks, of course, that my set of desires is constantly shifting. There's no fixed thing. But he also thinks that knowing myself means necessarily knowing my society and knowing my cultural context, because he's an he isn't just an anti-Kantian, he's an anti-Cartesian too. The mind is not a fixed internal theater in which I have my own thoughts, and then the question is, how do I get out from that ever? Rather, I am what I am only in my social and cultural context. Take the social and cultural context away and I'm not anything. Therefore, if I want to know myself, I have to know my desires, and my desires will be constantly shifting, and I have to learn to become a friend of my own desires and my shifting desires. And I have to know something about my cultural context and my social context, because that's what I am too. And the project then of comparing my own society, my own culture, with other societies and other cultures is part of the process of knowing myself. I know myself by virtue of knowing my own society and culture, and I know them only by virtue of comparing them with, not only, but I know them. One way in which I can get a better understanding of them is by comparing them with other possible societies and other real societies and cultures. So the process of getting acquainted with myself is also a process of getting acquainted with my society in its relation to other societies. And now, I'm sorry, I see that I've been too prolix here. I've only got 10 minutes left. I'm just going to say a few more words about cannibals, and then I've written out on the handout what I was going to say. So I don't it's not terrible, I suppose, if I stop. But let me just say one thing. So I want to call him Voltaire. He's not Voltaire. Montaigne. So Montaigne says, look, if I look around at my own society, I see that my society categorizes societies in a contradictory way, in an incoherent way. It uses two different contrasts to classify society. It classifies society as savage or civilized, and it classes societies as natural or artificial. And it tries to connect those two sets of dichotomies in incoherent ways. It tries to say that it itself is civilized, but it's also natural. And that all the other societies it encounters, for example, these colonial societies it encounters in imperialist contexts, the indigenous people who are being subjected to these things, they're both natural, but they're not natural and good. They're natural and they're natural and artificial. And he just points out that you can't use these two sets of dichotomy in a coherent way. They keep shifting back and forth between the two of them. And that he eventually then thinks, as you know, that really what's going on here is not a distinction between savage and cultivated or natural and unnatural. What's really going on here is a form of natural self-centeredness. That is, everything that's characteristic of our society we think is good and natural and civilized, and everything that's a characteristic of other societies we think is savage and artificial. And so the real distinction there is what's known to us and familiar to us and what's not familiar to us. And that then he moves to this discussion of the way in which all of these concepts are useful, but they're all deeply contextual. There's no such thing as absolutely natural, absolutely civilized, absolutely barbarous. These are all terms that we can use in various ways, but there's no groundwork for them. There's no fundamental acontextual way of using them. They're always holistic and comparative in their use. And I'd like to just then finish by talking about these two things. It's a wonderful thing at the end. One of my favorite passages in all literature, where Montaigne talks about the two indigenous Brazilians who come to France, and he says they wondered at three things, and I forget what one of the things was, but two of the things that I remember was they wondered that strong young men obeyed a weak child. That is the monarchy. The king is a weak child, and the strong men are these warriors from the Amazon. And why do people who are naturally grown up and strong, why do they obey something who is a weak child who doesn't know anything? And the answer to that, of course, is the artificial concept we have of political authority. They can't understand political authority because it makes no sense to them. Why should the strong people who are experienced obey this man just because he's the son of the king and therefore has this political status? So Montaigne uses their observation to get a kind of distance from the conception of political authority that's important in his society. And the second thing is the wonderful passage in which he said they noticed that some people in your society have much, much more than they need, and other people have nothing. And they couldn't understand why the people who had nothing didn't burn the houses of those who had too much and throttle them to death. And there too, you see, as it were, Montaigne's seeing of property rights and property entitlements through the eyes of someone who has a more who has not been subject to the same kind of discipline, and to the people from Brazil, this looks to be ridiculous. The reason the people who have nothing don't burn the houses of those who have too much and don't throttle them is that they all think that there are these things called property rights and that the people who have too much have a right to that. And from the point of view of the Brazilians, this looks ridiculous, artificial, and completely contrary to good sense. And I merely point out that this strikes me as really the high point of Montaigne's analysis, because Montaigne himself, of course, was a wealthy property owner and an aristocrat in Bordeaux. And if they were going to burn the houses of people who had too much, his would have been one of the first they burned. And he was a former magistrate in the city of Bordeaux. So if you thought that political authority was completely unnatural, he would be one of the last people. He would be one of the people who'd be affected by that too. So both of these things are things that are deeply, deeply contrary to his own self-interest, and he sees them and reports them anyway.